back to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent. The Trump administration wants American museums to be less critical of our history. On Tuesday, the White House called for a comprehensive internal review of 8 Smithsonian museums. The purpose is to get these institutions to celebrate American exceptionalism, not to discuss race so much, and not to negatively discuss the president. Already, one Smithsonian museum changed its exhibit about Donald Trump. It omitted that the president made false statements challenging his 2020 election loss, as well as a statement that said Trump delivered a speech that encouraged lawless action at the Capitol. The current administration wants our museums to end partisanship and, quote, restore confidence in our shared cultural institutions. But many worry that instead, the president is stoking an already heated culture war and chilling free speech. This move ignites big questions. How should these museums respond? How should American museums react to criticism and make appropriate changes? And what is their role in critiquing and celebrating American life? To discuss all this, we have Devin Ackman here. He's the director of Michigan State University Museum and is a core faculty member in MSU's Arts, Cultural Management, and Museum Studies program. Devin, welcome to the Metro.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So, Devin, not everyone goes to museums. Sometimes they exist as an afterthought, as perhaps a way to kill time even when you're visiting a new place. Why do museums matter? At their best, what are they offering us?
Well, museums offer us so much. I mean, there's the basic things of education and inspiration, but like so many other institutions in our society, museums have radically been evolving in the 21st century to become critical social infrastructure to combat things like loneliness and isolation and a variety of other factors. So museums serve our communities in vibrant and evolving ways, and it's no longer just a place for contemplation and reverie.
You've worked in museums, you've consulted in museums. What museums decide to go inside and the way they get placed in the museum, all of that really matters. Can you talk about who makes those decisions?
Well, museums make these decisions often through vigorous strategic planning and a lot of navel gazing. There's lots of interesting questions that museums consider. They reflect the communities they serve. They reflect the interest in the communities they serve. They ask themselves, are we telling accurate and holistic stories? What do our collections look like? They also look at a variety of other things that we're facing as society evolves, algorithms that are telling us what to read and what movies to see, so how to leverage technologies. So, our nation is evolving, and museums are evolving with those in a variety of ways, and that includes deeply considering the makeup of our exhibitions and our content.
So you're saying a big part of the evolution is more community engagement, is really considering how the content within museums is powerfully speaking to communities.
Yes, indeed. I think there's really two things. I mean, historically, we can think of museums as being primarily content-driven, mostly tangible objects with one-way information, i.e. the museum presents information to audiences and we really focus on presentation and display. And that has changed. We are now looking at a combination of audience and content-driven, a combination of tangible and digital objects, co-creation, working with our audiences in highly collaborative ways. So you can see this is a fundamental shift in how we operate. And then we're very cognizant of the drastic change that's taking place in our nation. I mean, when we look at Generation Alpha, we realize that this generation is projected to be the first majority minority generation in the United States. So something like DEI gets posed as a political maneuver or, something woke. Whereas some institutions might look at that and say, well, that's basically our audience. How do we evolve the strategic imperative? So it's very interesting, and it's a very dynamic thing to navigate that's being hyper politicized right now.
And to that point of what's being hyper politicized within museums, I am wondering what the process for making changes to museums tends to be. Let's say, if something doesn't seem right to a group of people about what they're seeing in a museum, what's the proper way for someone to critique that?
Well, we often begin as museums. We like to begin, and we're trusted institutions. So is the information we are presenting scholarly integrity? Like, we have to interrogate that. Is it backed by accurate information and research? And that, studies have come out in recent years that position museums as being among the most trusted institutions in our nation. And that's saying something, given all the things we can agree on in society today. So to maintain that benchmark, we have to present accurate and reliable information. And the minute we lower that benchmark, we no longer become trusted. So it needs to be evaluated, and we need to back that up with scholarship.
I want to stay on that point for a moment here because it's quite a salient one. You're saying that museums are some of the most trusted institutions in the U.S. and certainly I would think abroad as well. So talk a little bit more about the implications here if the Smithsonian changes its content more at the behest of President Donald Trump.
Well, you're bringing up a really important point. I mean, we've really prided ourselves as a field on this particular fact that we are trusted. When we look at all the things we can agree on, that museums have remained trusted. Museums and libraries, I would add.
Yeah.
And now we are being critiqued heavily, politically, by the President of the United States, which inevitably, my fear is, will begin to sow distrust in our nation towards our museums. So this is a very precarious moment we're dealing with. And while it's centered on the Smithsonian, it has the ability to cascade and impact communities across our nation. So it's a very slippery slope we're navigating right now, as this is focused specifically on a government set of museums, but the implications are wide-reaching. And how that plays out in the coming months and years remains to be seen.
I mean, President Trump, it appears, is reacting to changes that have been emerging in American culture, changes that are more critical, for example, of colonialism, of Western values. Devin, you've worked in museums for a long time. You were the director of the Arab American National Museum. And you mentioned this a little bit, how things like DEI are working themselves more into the minds of museum administrators. And that is a response to the way that society is changing and a response to new generations. So I'm wondering, how you would characterize this moment in time when it comes to museums changing. How have they tried to change in the last 20 or 30 years? Can you give a specific example even?
Well, I think, drawing on my previous institution, which I love dearly, the Arab American National Museum, is a great example. The Arab American National Museum was founded largely because, despite the sizable community here, both in Michigan and across the nation, very little was being shown in our nation's museums about Arab Americans, or it wasn't being told accurately. So a community worked together nationally to build this institution. And its community-based model has actually become an example nationally. Several community-based museums across our country that are like the Arab American National Museum, and their practice has been adopted by larger organizations, larger museums, to think about how to better represent communities. So I think that's a really good model, and that's a really good way of showing how the Arab American National Museum, for example, was very good at working with its communities to make sure it was telling a holistic and appropriate story that was grounded in research, but it also involved the community to get a more represented story. And that makes us a stronger nation. Additionally, I think a point worth adding is, and this is what's concerning me right now with the way this is unfolding in Washington, is, we have trusted institutions, museums again, right? And what better place to have dialogue and discussion? I mean, another shift in museums has gone from being what we would call didactic to dialogic. And there's no better place to have dialogue about these challenging issues than in museums. So as opposed to just coming in and doing sweeping changes and saying, I like this, I don't like this, museums are perhaps best equipped to say, let's hold space to actually have dialogue around this issue. And that would be, I think, a more exciting and appropriate way to navigate this and bring people together around these issues to explore as a nation, especially as we're going into our nation's 250th anniversary.
I mean, as you talk about the Arab American Museum here in Dearborn, it also has me thinking about cultural group museums like the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. They're both Smithsonian affiliates, and they both tell really difficult histories and how those histories have affected certain communities, oftentimes marginalized communities. Now, the Arab American Museum has become a real pillar of support and a third space amid what some experts are increasingly calling a genocide in Gaza. How could these museums be affected, and how could the communities that are relying on these museums for third spaces talk more about your concerns about that?
Well, I think these are both great examples. I mean, the Arab American National Museum hosts so much wonderful programming to explore these topics and to bring communities together. They're not ethno-specific institutions, or ethnocentric, I should say. They are ethno-specific. So they tell their story, but it's a welcoming way for other communities to come in and say, well, that's my story, or how we connect through culture. I mean, culture is such a wonderful way to actually bring people together through food and music and so many other issues. And at the Arab American National Museum, for example, you have a wonderful space called the Annex next door, which was purposely built as a community space. The Japanese American National Museum has the Center for Democracy right next to the museum, which is another space, purposely built to bring community together around difficult issues, to explore both within their ethno-specific community, but also with the larger communities that comprise our region as welcoming spaces. So these are both institutions that have really been on the leading edge of creating physical space, but also dialogue around these issues. And I think we all have something to learn by their practice.
Devin, let's look at the museum that you lead, which is the MSU Museum. What happens if we defund museums? What could the impact be at a museum like the one that you direct?
Yes, well, that's a great question. We too are a Smithsonian affiliated museum. And speaking to the federal funding, we've had very fortunate luck in getting a lot of federal funding. In fact, we just had 2 grants from the Institute of Museum and Library Services that were originally canceled, but we have now gotten the return funding due to how it's playing out in the courts. It's very difficult for us to plan forward because this is a multi-year grant. So we have to essentially right now plan our execution of the grant work on a monthly basis to ensure we can get reimbursed and don't incur debt. We've already had to lay off some of our student employees because of the lack of this. So it has a drastic impact on our ability to carry out commitments and to plan for the future with this type of uncertainty. And we are just one of many museums that make up the constellation of our nation.
Devin, this has me wondering how it's affecting morale at your museum. I mean, you're painting a picture of a bit of chaos, of uncertainty.
It's definitely challenging times, but I'm so incredibly proud of our staff. We are continuing to plan big projects for the future, and we're continuing to find creative and innovative ways to carry forward our work even in these challenging times. And I think that is indicative of, frankly, museums across our country. They're largely resilient organizations, and we will find ways through this.
In the last 30 seconds that we have here, the president's administration is, again, trying to change what's presented and how things are presented in American museums. Have you ever seen an American president do something like this to intervene at what goes on in our country's museums, or is this moment unprecedented?
I believe this is truly unprecedented. We have debated these types of things, what is appropriate culturally, what isn't, for many, many years. However, to have within the first 6-7 months of an administration come in and have a literal takeover of our nation's performing arts venue, and what we're seeing with the Smithsonian, and then the erosion of funding from all federal funding agencies that support our cultural infrastructure, it is really a first, and it's very, very concerning.
Okay, one more for you, and I'm going to ask you to answer it in maybe less than 30 seconds, in 20. What advice would you give to other museum directors around the country right now, seeing the pressure that's on the Smithsonian?
I would suggest them to continue to be innovative in their work, to continue to resonate with their local communities, and to also uplift and be better storytellers of how their work impacts both our local communities and our nation.
Devin Ackman is the director of Michigan State University Museum. Devin, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
Coming up, a pop-up food festival is coming back to Detroit's North End. We'll speak with the organizer of Hospitality Included. That's next on the Metro. We'll be right back after the news from NPR and WDET. This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.